When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, the Soviet Union was a communist country with one of the greatest military arsenals in the world. 6 years later, when he resigned, communism had collapsed and nuclear weapons were being destroyed. In the West, he's a hero, but in his own country, his popularity has slumped. The fertile farmlands of southern Russia, where Mikhail Gorbachev was born and brought up. His ancestors were Ukrainian Cossacks. The Gorbachev family lived in the small village of Privolnya, half a day's journey from the regional capital at Stavropol. His father Sergei worked on a collective farm. Mikhail was born here in 1931 during one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history. The Soviet Union, as it was then known, was ruled with a rod of iron by Joseph Stalin, who ruthlessly suppressed all opposition. Hundreds of thousands of people were imprisoned or deported to camps in Siberia. Relatives of the Gorbachev family were among them.
His grandparents on both sides were classified as rich farmers, and that meant that they were deported. That made people around them very frightened of the family, because it meant that they were classified as enemies of the country and enemies of the people.
He had a lonely childhood until he went to school.
I think I was very lucky. My family were only ordinary people, but they loved me and showed me by their example how to survive. They always said, get yourself an education, because they hadn't had a chance to have one themselves.
He was a model pupil.
His favorite subjects were history and math. He was always the center of attention because he was brighter than the rest of us. He was a good organizer, and we all liked him.
He was also a model worker. In 1948, when he was 17, he helped his father bring in a record harvest. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labour, a rare honour for a teenager. 2 years later, he was the only member of his class to get a place at the university in Moscow. The medal almost certainly made all the difference.
For Gorbachev to come from Stavropol and to win a place at Moscow State University both meant that he'd done very well educationally, but also that he was considered to be promising from a political point of view, because unless you were promising politically, you could never get a place at such a prestigious institution.
In 1950, the boy from the country arrived in the capital. Gorbachev studied law and joined the Communist Party. He began to display an unusual talent for leadership.
Gorbachev
was that rare individual who was liked by almost everyone. He was reliable and trustworthy. We had two rival leaders for our young Communist League, so we appointed Gorbachev to bring the rivalry to an end. The problem was that all his political work did get in the way of his education.
Then in 1953, Stalin died.
The first response was total shock. Even quite clever people believed that life could never go on as before. But quite soon afterwards, there was suddenly a relaxation of tension, and it began to dawn on people that they had lived a life of tremendous fear.
Stalin's reign of terror was over. In 1955, Mikhail Gorbachev passed his law exams and returned to Stavropol. Stavropol is a market town, which has always been an important center of farming. Gorbachev soon abandoned law and came to work here at the regional headquarters of the Communist Party. Within months, the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was telling the party it was time to shake off Stalin's legacy of fear.
It
was the beginning of a remarkable period of open discussion in Soviet politics. For Gorbachev, just beginning his career in Stavropol, it took time to digest.
People who tell you that they had everything clear in their minds in those days are lying. Even today, Stalin is inside many people. It is not easy to break the habits of the past. It's a slow process, a process of changing your mind and changing your heart.
It is clearly a period that marked those people who lived through it. It opened them to other kinds of ideas. Gorbachev was a part of that ferment, and he was very deeply affected by it.
In Stavropol, there were new opportunities for ambitious young men. Mikhail Gorbachev earned a reputation for being flexible and friendly.
He was just a man carrying out instructions. What made him different was that he was really energetic. He was a chatty man with a quick mind, and it was a pleasure to deal with someone who would give you an immediate and detailed reply.
Gorbachev kept his head down and rose through the ranks of the Communist Party. In the early 1960s, he was appointed regional organizer of farming. He grew increasingly frustrated by the system.
If people wanted to do anything, they had to break the rules. And I very often had to defend collective farm chairmen who had broken the law. I remember a farm manager who wanted to irrigate his land. All he wanted to do was improve his farm. But he had to use black market pipes. They were the only ones he could get hold of. I defended these people and refused to authorize their arrest.
Stavropol is one of the grain baskets of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev became good at getting things done. His reputation spread, and he was promoted to the top job, head of the regional Communist Party. He started mixing with national leaders. One of them was the new Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, who was impressed by his hands-on approach to farming. In 1978, Gorbachev was invited to Moscow to run the entire country's farming program. He was 47, the first of his generation to join the country's leadership. Two years later, he was promoted to the Politburo, the top policy-making body in the Soviet Union. When he came to Britain in 1984, It was clear he was a new kind of Soviet politician.
He was far more relaxed about his person. He was far less afraid of the press and answering questions. And he was a man who answered questions with real replies rather than just reciting bits that he'd learnt off by heart.
When he met the then British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, he charmed her with his openness.
Mrs. Thatcher came away from that meeting saying that Gorbachev was a man one could do business with. In other words, she recognized him as being potentially a very important leader, and she also recognized that he was a new kind of leader, and the chance was, therefore, that the Soviet Union would become a new kind of country.
The following year, the Soviet Union buried its third leader in 3 years. All of them had been men in their 70s. It was time for a younger person. In March 1985, Gorbachev was appointed the new ruler.
Трудящимся стран социалистического содружества, правительством.
Gorbachev inherited a country in need of reform. Living standards were falling and the economy was failing. Almost immediately, he broke with tradition and took to the streets to talk to his people.
My attitude to ordinary people isn't a game. It is not for show. I treat people with respect because they come from the same sort of place as I do. And I have never forgotten where I came from. I'm just like them.
But the country was locked into a dangerous and expensive competition with America to produce ever more powerful nuclear weapons. Reform would only be possible if he could end the arms race.
He knew how many nuclear weapons had been accumulated. He believed that one of those weapons, they say that if there is a gun in the room in the first act of some play, then it will fire in the final act. So he felt that one day those guns may fire. One day a nuclear holocaust may become a possibility, and he didn't want that.
Gorbachev set out on a series of international summit meetings to negotiate a peace deal. Western leaders had never met a Soviet politician like him. In December 1987, he went to Washington.
Welcome to the United States of America.
He took America, accustomed to seeing Soviet leaders as cold and unapproachable, by storm.
That was very special. He didn't have to do it, and he did it. I am very surprised and pleased.
What do you think of Gorbachev?
The guy is a PR genius.
Away from the showmanship, there were frank diplomatic exchanges. Then Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan emerged to announce an historic breakthrough. The two countries had agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals. They signed what became known as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, or INF Treaty.
We can be proud of planting this sapling, which may one day grow into a mighty tree of peace.
Pavel Palashch was Gorbachev's translator in Washington.
Gorbachev said to me, Pavel, do you understand what has happened? This is the first real arms reduction agreement, a real arms disarmament agreement rather than just arms control agreement. This is a real achievement for us and the Americans.
Gorbachev became a hero in the West, but at home it was a different story.
It actually undermined Gorbachev and it began the process whereby he seemed to be giving away too much to the West and getting too little back in return. It meant that Soviet citizens as a whole began to trust him rather less.
He chose not to see the gathering storm clouds. He talked of perestroika, or reform, and glasnost, meaning greater freedom of speech. He introduced free elections and abolished the Communist Party's monopoly of power. But his reform program was not delivering what he had promised. Food queues grew and the shops were emptier. The Soviet people began to lose faith in him. Elsewhere in the Soviet bloc, the people of communist Eastern Europe saw an opportunity and rose up against their Soviet leaders. Gorbachev refused to send in the Red Army. By the winter of 1989, the infamous Berlin Wall, symbol of Soviet rule, was being torn down. Back in Moscow, Soviet citizens felt betrayed. Gorbachev had given away their empire and with it their position in the world. In the eyes of many of his people, he'd become a Soviet villain. In August 1991, while he was out of Moscow, the blow fell. News seeped out that there'd been a coup. Gorbachev was held under house arrest in his holiday home by communist hardliners. There was fighting between Gorbachev's supporters and groups opposed to him. It was 3 days before the coup was defeated. A shaken Gorbachev returned to Moscow and tried to take up again the reins of power. But too many people had lost confidence in him. "18 months later, he resigned. In the West, he was given the Nobel Prize for his contribution to world peace, but in his own country, he'd made too many enemies."
Gorbachev was the first leader in the Soviet Union to introduce reforms and then to have the courage to follow them through.
Today, Gorbachev lives quietly in Moscow, running a political and economic think tank. He believes he could still be in power if he'd chosen to be.
I had absolute power. If my ideal had just been to keep power, then today you'd be talking, if you were allowed to the General Secretary of the Communist Party. But that's not what I wanted.